To Health Center. I'm Dr. Monica Sweeney, professor in the School of Public Health here at Downstate. Thank you for being with us. I'm very happy today to welcome our guest, Dr. Hoepner, who is a professor in the School of Public Health, and she has her DrPH. She is here to discuss a very important subject. Thank you for being here, Dr. Hoepner.
Thank you for having me.
We can call each other by our names now, can't we? So we're going to talk about obesity and your research on obesity. Can you tell us about obesity in children and what's been going on in the last few years?
Yes, of course. Obesity has been on the rise in children. It's an epidemic, and where we started to see the epidemic climb is around the 1970s, and today the numbers are around 20% of the population of children aged 2 to 19 years of age could be classified as obese. The problem with children being obese is that you think about the developmental origins of disease and how children come about to have a problem of obesity and increased adiposity or increased fat mass, and then what the later complications are in life from having obesity at a young age.
You know what I want you to do, because there are a lot of people that don't do well with 20%. Would you describe 20% for all of the audience, what that means? So if you had 100 children.
1 in 5 children could be classified as obese.
Okay, 1 in 5. That makes it, we all can understand that.
Yeah.
Now, by what measure are they obese?
So in children, determining obesity is a little different from adults. In adults, you look straight at the body mass index, or the BMI, and that is just a fraction of looking at the weight over height. And in children, it's actually standardized against a population that the CDC had determined, a nationwide sample. And in children, you're actually looking at something called a BMI percentile, or a BMI Z-score, which is what my research looked at, standardized, a more standardized measure. So in children, classification of obesity is a BMI percentile of 95 or higher, 95th percentile or higher. And there's also where you start to have a warning sign, perhaps from a physician, when the child is between 85th percentile and 95th percentile. They're considered overweight.
So when most children go to their pediatrician, this is a standard measure that's done. Is that correct?
Yes. So it's basically, you're still just taking height and weight, which would happen at every physician visit, but they can graph it. There's a graph that's made from the CDC. It's based on sex of the child. There's a graph for girls and a graph for boys, and then they could plot it. Of course, computers today can do that for them, and a computer would spit out a number for them.
I'm just going to go back one second to say clinicians, because I am physician-oriented, being one, but for our audience, you may go to some clinician that's not a physician, and they do the same plotting for measuring this very important piece of data. So now tell us a little bit about your research.
Well, our research was focused mostly or all on children who were either of African American or Dominican descent and who lived in northern Manhattan or the South Bronx. And their mothers were living there when they were pregnant with the children, and they were they were enrolled at the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. So it's a longitudinal study, meaning it's a birth cohort where the children have been being followed over time since 1998. And
that's a very long study.
It is.
That's a very long longitudinal study.
Very fortunate.
Very good.
So and many children have stayed in the study. Many mothers have stayed in the study. So it's a very rich source of information about the health of children from being in the womb. The study that I was involved in was looking at exposures that the children have when they're prenatal, in the womb, in utero, and what happens potentially if there's a relationship over time as the children get older.
What is the relationship that you're looking at? Because in my community that I grew up in and that I spend a lot of time in, they say the child is just like the mother or just like the father, or it's my genes, everybody knows genes now. So what relationship were you looking at?
I was looking at the relationship between exposures to bisphenol A, or BPA as it's commonly known, which is in a lot of different plastics and a lot of different consumer products that we come in contact with every day. So it would be no surprise that the mothers might have come in contact with that, and sure enough, we did find that maternal exposure was around 92-93% of mothers in the study have been exposed to bisphenol A while they were pregnant, which is similar to national numbers across the board.
Why is this product important in terms of your study? What did you find in terms of a relationship between BPA and obesity?
So we found that so when I mentioned obesity and the classification of obesity for children, we're talking about BMI, the height and the weight, just straight height and weight measures. But what I was more interested in was actual measures of adiposity. In other words, the actual fat mass, the fat cells that are existing on the body versus just height and weight. Because height and weight it's a quick and easy measure, but it doesn't tell you necessarily about what's on the body. For example, a classic example would be Arnold Schwarzenegger when he was Mr. Olympia in his heyday, all muscle, pure muscle, no fat mass at all in his body probably. His classification would be obese because he weighed so much and because of his height. So it's not necessarily such a direct measure. It's a good indicator. So I was interested in actual adiposity measures and looking at, of course I looked at BMI itself, but I was looking more for these measures of the tissue.
Where did you look for the tissue?
Well,
what parts of the body?
So we were able to look at fat mass by using a machine that, it's a bioimpedance machine that actually sends a little harmless electrical signal through the body, and it can detect all kinds of tissue in the body, fat mass, non-fat mass, water in the body, all sorts of things. So I looked at the fat mass that could be detected with this machine, but also waist circumference using a tape measure. This is a really good way to determine whether or not there's adipose tissue being laid down around the waist. And this is a common area for where there will be development of this tissue.
Well, the waist is, but I thought it was hip to waist ratio, or is that not in children?
In children, it's very common to use waist circumference, and of course, when you are doing a study, you want to be able to compare your results to previous literature and see if there's similarities, if there's a pattern, or if you're finding something different.
Now, could you tell us what some of the products are that people are exposed to? First of all, did you measure this in the mothers or just children, the levels of bisphenol A?
So we were interested in two things. Of course, we were interested in exposures in utero, and we were interested in exposures during childhood. So we looked at urine from the mothers that was taken during the third trimester, one urine sample during third trimester. And we also looked at urines from the children during childhood, one sample at 3 years of age, 5 years of age, 3 years of age, and 5 years of age. There's more, but that's what we were looking at in terms of exposures in children. And
what are the products that we come in contact with that could expose us to this chemical?
So BPA is commonly used as a plastic hardener. So there are many plastic water bottles that are hard, that likely, especially the older ones, contain BPA. And also it's used as a liner in cans, all kinds of food cans. So there's something called an epoxy resin, and the BPA is a tiny little chemical. It's two little rings of carbon with hydroxyl groups hanging off of it. It's a tiny chemical that then can be combined, added together, and it makes an epoxy resin, which can be used inside of a food can.
Is it commonly used in food cans?
Commonly used in food cans, although some food companies are taking the BPA out and using different chemicals and stating that as BPA-free, but even soda cans would have that, the interior lining of milk cartons. If you ever notice that sort of like plastic, you can almost get it under your nail. It's
BPA?
Yes. Well, most likely it's an epoxy resin, so most likely BPA.
As an environmentalist, as an expert in environmental, it looks like you have work to do, not only to find out its significance, but then we have to have policies, which we can do together in the School of Public Health, to try and get this from being used if it turns out that this is a precursor to obesity.
Yes, and I'm sorry to interrupt.
And is it boys and girls?
So in our study, the main findings looked at boys and girls together, and we found results that the bisphenol A prenatally, not exposure during childhood, but exposure prenatally, was associated with an increase in the measures of adipose tissue. And we then looked at them separately, looked at, it's called stratification, looking at girls versus boys, and only for one measure of adiposity, what is called the fat mass index, which is very similar to the BMI. Instead of putting the weight divided by height in meters squared, you would put the fat mass that you get from that machine divided by height. And we did see a significant difference between girls and boys. And so it's not a main finding, but it does hint that there could be a sex difference. And where that's important is that other studies have seen sex differences, but it's not necessarily across the board the same kind of sex difference at the same age.
So you have more work to do on this.
There's a lot more work to be done.
So the thing that when you found these prenatal exposures and it seems to have an impact, what kinds of things would you tell? You just told us it's inside the lining of cans. Do we need to start looking at cans to see whether it says no BPA free?
Well, because the regulation is spotty on BPA, and many companies are self-regulating and self-removing and putting in replacements, it's important to be aware. I really believe in awareness of the environment and products and chemicals in products. However, there is concern that the replacements, such as BPS and BPF, are not necessarily any better because the chemical looks just like BPA and may act just like BPA. So what's more important is to try to eat healthy in terms of eating fresh fruits and vegetables that are not coming in contact with these sorts of linings, trying to use containers for water or beverage consumption that are not using plastic, so stainless steel or glass, trying to find other ways than using plastic. And in addition, if you are using plastic, to keep it away from sources of friction, sources of temperature extremes, so high heat or high cold, not freezing our water bottles, not putting our water containers and other food containers in the dishwasher.
It's not just heat,
No.
It's freezing as well.
Freezing, heat, friction, in a dishwasher, the friction of the rumbling of everything together, it can cause that those molecules that are all strung together, the epoxy molecules, can break off into the food because they become weakened. The other concern, of course, especially with high acid foods such as tomato sauces, you want to be concerned because the acid is possibly going to leach the BPA out of that plastic lining in a way that's different from other food materials that are not as acidic.
Well, the question then is this something that should be observed lifelong? I mean, I'm not having any more children. Is this something that I should look for, or just tell my daughter to look about it for my grandchildren, making sure that she follows these suggestions that you just had?
Well, I think it's important for everybody to be aware of what they're consuming. BPA is in a lot of different plastics, and just trying to use alternatives to plastics. But definitely for women who are thinking about becoming pregnant or are pregnant or of fertile age, and for children as well, because the science is not 100% there yet. We don't know everything yet. To just be cautious and be educated about what you're actually putting on the table and the products that your food is touching.
you make it, it's a very major problem when you start saying, don't freeze it, don't heat it, high temperatures, don't put it in the dishwasher. So an example of a product that has a high, like, there are stratifications. So what is one product you can think of that you can say, even if now and then you do that, don't use that? Is it putting it in the microwave?
Again, it really would depend on what is being contained in the product. For many reasons, I don't recommend microwaving plastic because it can melt, and plastic may not. Again, BPA is a plastic hardener. There are other chemicals that we know are associated with health outcomes that are in plastic, such as phthalates, which are a plastic softener. So we don't know necessarily what's in the plastic. I would definitely not recommend microwaving.
I just have to tell you, I'm sorry I didn't bring it because I didn't know we would go in this direction, but I had a little water bottle that had been in the car for a while, and I washed it, then I put it in the microwave to finish sterilizing it, and it went from a bottle this size to a bottle that size. And I keep it in the refrigerator to remind people not to put plastic in the microwave. So
that's a great idea.
Yeah, I think we all should do that to remind people of how much chemical reaction goes on when you send it to that high temperature. So you say there's not a point that we should stop being aware of it, but thinking about obesity in children, there are definitely additional problems than the problems of adults. Adults have been through the childhood phase, and now they're adults and they can deal with the issues. What are some of the main issues that we're trying to avoid by keeping these children from being obese?
Well, obesity at an early age can have problems later on in life, such as cardiovascular disease, diabetes, arthritis, definitely, because it's also an inflammatory situation when you have an obese individual. So yes, there are definitely concerns and considerations. And in terms of adult onset obesity versus child obesity, and exposures, you're dealing with temporality. You're dealing with time. So it goes back to what I had said about developmental origins of disease. If you have a child who is starting out obese, then the question is what caused that early on, versus an adult where there are a lot more exposures that could have happened over time, and it's a little bit more difficult to suss out.
You could have a job sitting at a desk and
right,
not
the
moving
sedentary
around.
lifestyle, exactly.
What about the emotional aspects? And I know you're not a clinician, it doesn't matter, but we've all had people that we've known who have had morbid obesity or very obese, and some not even that obese, and have some emotional components to it.
Well, I definitely think that there are concerns about appearance when especially for children, and we know how stressful being a child is, especially in New York City, and as they become teenagers. And this is something that this particular birth cohort, it's being looked at also, are psychological outcomes. But I know from the research that I was involved in with BPA and obesity, we had some missing data, and that was sometimes because of refusals. Especially with the waist circumference, they did not want the tape measure around the waist. Either a mom didn't or a child didn't. And if they refuse, you can't do it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like a lot of denial going on with obesity, and that only gets worse often as the obesity gets worse. So we want to make sure that the parents have something to take away, and in addition to the things that we've already discussed. So if you go to your clinician now, do you ask your clinician to check your child for a BPA?
I would love, in my dream world, that would be a situation that could happen. Unfortunately, that sort of monitoring doesn't exist in the pediatric office, no matter who the clinician is. But what should happen are those vital statistics of the height and the weight and all the other healthy statistics that would be done in a clinician's office. And then that clinician can chart and help guide the parent for whether or not the child is on course potentially for obesity or being overweight, or whether they're at something that is more average.
Normal trajectory for their weight. The thing is, though, if a clinician does this, you could then go back and look at, do a retrospective and look at the record all along if they only had one sample. So I'm just suggesting that since there are a lot more questions to answer, that we're in a situation where maybe we need to start cozying up with some clinicians who do pediatrics.
That would again be my dream. Let's join environmental and occupational health science and the School of Public Health with the School of Medicine and start a program for teaching soon-to-be clinicians.
Environmental with a pediatrician, with the
how to look for environmental triggers or precursors to disease.
Because we have an epidemic that's really going out of control. And I don't know if you looked at this, whether the use when plastics became everywhere. I mean, they're everywhere in everything, whether there's any timeline that would suggest.
There is.
There is.
So BPA, the very, very short history of BPA, although BPA has been around for over 100 years now, it was invented by a Russian chemist, and he named it after himself. But anyway, fast forward to the 1950s, and two individual scientists, one at GE and one at Bayer, so GE in the United States and Bayer in Germany, working completely independently, discovered that BPA could be made into the plastic that we know today and the epoxy resin that we know today. And just a couple of years after that, the mid to late 50s, BPA production started to explode. Today, I'm afraid to quote the number, I think I'm searching my memory, 4 million tons of BPA annually are produced. It's not going anywhere anytime soon. It's a major industry.
It's ubiquitous.
It's ubiquitous.
And so it's our responsibility, as you were talking about the parents, to look for what they can do to keep their children from doing it. I'm not so sure that people in certain generations will do it. It's so convenient to open a can.
Sure.
But certainly for the parents, we want to be sure that they're looking at it. And for women who are childbearing age.
Yes, yes.
Should when you do prenatal, I know you're not a clinician, but I'm just asking in terms of the environmental and the clinical, making it translate to useful information. So when a woman is preparing to have a child, and we tell them to get their MMR titers to make sure they have them and to do all that, should they do a BPA urine level?
Again, this is the sort of chemical analysis that you need a specialized lab.
Okay.
So yes, I would love if that could happen. We, in this study and many studies that are involved in the United States, often send their samples to the CDC, where they have standardization and it's accepted because across research studies, you can compare results and say it was done the same way. So we're not there yet, but maybe one day it could happen.
Well, it is very important for us to make sure. So we've talked about the parents and protecting their children, and we've talked about whether it's a big worry or not. It's a concern.
It's a concern.
It's definitely a concern.
It's an easy concern, especially for things that are marked on the bottom. Look for a number 3 or a number 7, and it most likely has BPA in it.
If there's a number 3 or a number 7 on the bottom of the can,
or plastic
or
container,
plastic, it most likely has BPA. Well, we can all do that. The question is there lots of strings of numbers? Is this a number that stands out usually by itself?
Yes, it would be in a triangle. Number 3 means PVC, which is a plastic or a vinyl, a polyvinyl, which is normally made with phthalates, but could be containing BPA. It depends on the manufacturer. Number 7 is a catch-all number. It's actually unknown what goes into number 7, but BPA, if something is known to be made with BPA, it'll wind up in as a number 7.
So number 3 doesn't have BPA.
It may have BPA.
It may have BPA.
It's
number
likely.
7. So if you have a 3 or a 7, don't give it to the kids.
Don't use it.
Don't use it. Don't buy it. I want to thank you very much for being here, Dr.
Thank you.
Hoepner. It's very informative We have to try, us in the School of Public Health, to not wait until a disease happens. We try and prevent it.
Yes.
And thank you very much for your discussion of obesity and BPA.
Thank you.
This is all for today. We hope you will join us next time here at Health Center.